Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Have you ever stopped to think that the real hero might not be on TV or in movies, but sweating on the asphalt of your city while you read this? In 2025, as the United States faced the deadliest summer in its history, with cities boiling over 130 degrees, 54 degrees, some people locked their doors, and one man chose to knock on all of them. Ethan Myers had no title, no fortune, no fame, but he had something many people lack: the courage to act while others hid, and that's why he died. Not by accident, by choice. What you're about to see isn't just a tragedy. It's one of the most brutal, inspiring, and unsettling stories ever to sweep through this country. A real plot line that will make you sweat, not from heat, but from shame and emotion. Because unlike what many believe, changing the world doesn't take millions. It takes minutes of humanity. And Ethan proved that with his body, his soul, and a single water bottle. You already know how it ends. But the beginning, that's what will break you inside. And maybe rebuild you too. The summer of 2025 in the United States wasn't just hot. It was relentless. Imagine walking down the street and feeling the pavement burn through your shoes, like the city itself had become an oven. In Phoenix, the thermometer passed 130 degrees, but the crisis went far beyond numbers. The heat swallowed life, dried up smiles, melted daily routines. And in the middle of that, new stories emerged, some of survival, others of neglect. Have you ever tried sleeping without a fan on a stifling night? Now multiply that by days without power, inside a sealed house with no clean water. Hundreds of elderly people passed out on sidewalks while children fanned themselves with pot lids. It was like nature was screaming and the system just put on headphones. But even in the middle of chaos, some stories rise to remind us that someone is still listening. What's curious is that the drama hit hardest in the forgotten neighborhoods. Not by chance, by neglect. Areas with no shade, no support, not even an open aid station. In these places, every act of care became a spark of hope. Because in times like these, it's not the caped heroes who save lives. It's the ones in sweat-soaked t-shirts carrying water bottles and a will too big for the news to capture. That's how Ethan became part of this story. Ethan Myers was the kind of person you'd overlook in a grocery store, but carried a universe inside. A war veteran, he knew what it was like to face the impossible. Only this time, the battle wasn't in the field. It was on the blistering streets. When he saw people collapsing in parked cars, he realized waiting for help wasn't an option. And that's when stories that truly matter begin, the ones that don't ask permission to exist. While many watched the collapse from the comfort of their air conditioners, Ethan chose to act. He took his beat-up car, filled the trunk with water bottles, and drove the streets like a man on a mission. And he was. A mission no government assigned, but one his conscience couldn't ignore. Out there, every liter of water was more valuable than a medal. And in the end, that's what real stories are made of. How many times have you thought, but I'm just one person? Ethan was too. But he understood that being ordinary is no excuse for being indifferent. The world doesn't need superpowers, it needs people who care. Want to make a difference? Start small. Bring water to someone on the street. Offer a ride on a rainy day. Listen to someone no one hears. That's how generation-shaping stories begin. For 3 days straight, Ethan became a beacon in the middle of despair. While the city hid behind closed windows, trying to survive the heat that melted even thoughts, he did the opposite. He went out. Not because he was immune, but because he refused to ignore the suffering around him. Wearing simple clothes, a backpack, and a water bottle in each hand, he knocked on doors in the forgotten neighborhoods, the kind the government only visits to collect, never to care. Places where asphalt cracks but no one fixes it, where the sun punishes but no air conditioners arrive. He didn't ask for religion, skin color, or income. He simply offered what he could: a sip of relief, a seat in his car, a path to somewhere safer. And with every visit, another story was born. Silent but powerful, like hope planted in dry soil. One of those stories began with the faint cry of a 92-year-old woman. Trapped in a stifling apartment, she no longer had the strength to get out of bed. The power had been cut days earlier. The neighbors were all away or locked in with AC. When Ethan broke down the door, after hearing a whisper that sounded more like a prayer than a cry for help, he found a fragile body, with eyes still full of life. He carried her as if she were his own grandmother to a shelter with power and fans. Even knowing that the gesture might not fix everything, he knew it was enough to write another page in his mission. A story few would witness, but life would never forget. Another time, Ethan heard crying from inside a wooden house. A 5-year-old boy lay unconscious on a sweat-soaked mattress. The parents were in shock, unsure what to do. The room's thermometer read 113 degrees, 45 degrees. He didn't hesitate, picked up the child, motioned for the parents to follow, and ran to the nearest hospital. On the way, he pressed a water bottle to the child's forehead, whispering words that he didn't even know made sense, but somehow carried faith. He wasn't a doctor, had no ambulance, no protocol. But he had something rare, courage with compassion. And that, my friend, is worth more than any uniform. In moments like these, the difference between life and death fits in a single act, and every one of those acts became part of a great story. It's strange how, when the heat rises, so does the coldness in people. Social media was full of pretty phrases and heat warnings, but on the streets, silence. No one knocked on doors, no one offered water, no one checked on neighbors. But Ethan kept going, house by house, knowing he couldn't save everyone. And still he tried, because sometimes changing one destiny is enough to change the whole world. And anyone who's heard a single "thank you for saving me" knows that's worth more than likes or headlines. Only those who live this kind of mission understand the weight a story can carry. With each neighborhood he crossed, more stories emerged. Like the elderly couple who refused to leave because they didn't want to abandon their dog, Ethan didn't think twice. He picked up the dog, convinced the couple, and took them to a cooled community center. Days later, the old man wrote a letter with a trembling hand. "You saved 3 hearts and reminded us that kindness is survival too." That's what Ethan did. Reactivated humanity where the heat seemed to have melted everything. Not with speeches, but with presence. Not with money, but with action. Not with promises, but with results. At nightfall, when the temperature dropped a few degrees, he didn't rest. He reviewed city maps, asked NGO workers where help hadn't reached yet, and reloaded the trunk with water and food. He refused funding from companies that wanted publicity. He said, "I don't want sponsorship, I want partnership, and those who want the spotlight don't belong in this story." He was firm, not arrogant, humble, but never small. And anyone who crossed paths with him quickly realized this was someone who wasn't waiting for a hero. He had decided to become one. In the early hours of the 3rd day, he was seen helping a homeless man who could barely speak. The man had 2nd-degree burns on his back and couldn't stand. Ethan improvised a stretcher with a bedsheet, dragged him to the car, and spent the night awake beside an overcrowded ER. He didn't leave until he was sure the man would get care. Meanwhile, he slept in a plastic chair. When the nurse asked for his name, he simply said, "Doesn't matter, just take care of him." But the nurse wrote it down anyway. And that's how the name Ethan Myers began to circulate among healthcare workers, not as a patient, but as a symbol. These stories began to spread, first by word of mouth, then through homemade videos recorded by those who had been saved. A woman said, "He came in like a beam of light. When no one remembered I existed, he saw me." Another man, visibly emotional, shared, "I thought I was going to die in that studio apartment. I had already accepted it, but then he showed up." These words didn't come from a script. They came from the soul, and they spread across the country. Because when the truth is lived with such intensity, it doesn't need megaphones, just attentive eyes and hearts willing to listen. Ethan didn't carry signs, didn't have viral social media, and had no film crew, but every one of his actions was a message that said, "You matter." In a time when so many only move for profit, Ethan moved for what could be saved. And that's why his name, his actions, his stories began to take root. Seeds of change, of reflection, of purpose. Some young people began to imitate him. They wore shirts with the phrase, "water and courage," and knocked on doors in the same neighborhoods. People who once stayed in the air conditioning were now asking to help, because example doesn't push, it pulls. By the end of the 3rd day, Ethan could no longer hide the signs of exhaustion. His feet were swollen, his eyes bloodshot, his voice hoarse. Yet even so, when he saw a trailer with sealed windows and an eerie silence inside, he didn't hesitate. He broke down the door, found a man in shock, and dragged him to the car. It was as if each heartbeat whispered, "Just one more life, please." And that's what drove him to the very last second. Because for him, as long as someone needed help, there was still one more story to be written. On the fourth day of the heat wave, Ethan was no longer the same. His body was weak, eyes sunken, skin red and dry, as if life itself was being quietly drained by the heat. But still, he kept going. He kept going because he believed. Because inside him something bigger than fatigue still pulsed, the urgency to save one more life. His heart, seemingly unaware of the body's limits, kept pounding like a drum calling him to battle. And in that state, he spotted the trailer, windows sealed, engine off, and that haunting silence screaming for help. Ethan didn't hesitate. Staggering with blurred vision, he kicked the door open with what seemed like his last ounce of strength. Inside, he found a man collapsed on the floor, pale and lost in shock, drenched in sweat, nearly unconscious. Ethan didn't think twice. He slung the man's arm over his shoulder and with almost superhuman effort, dragged him to the car. It was as if every step said, just one more life. And so, with failing muscles, labored breathing, and a parched throat, he turned one more tragedy into one of the most powerful stories of empathy this country has ever seen. On the way to the hospital, the heat inside the car was suffocating, but Ethan didn't complain, didn't cry, didn't stop. He drove with one hand and with the other tried to guide the last bottle of water he had into the unconscious man's mouth. It was a simple gesture but deeply symbolic, choosing to offer the water that could save him, to save another. In that act was the full essence of the stories that changed the world. Because it wasn't just about rescue, it was love, selflessness, and a message that said, your life matters as much as mine. When he finally arrived at the hospital, he could barely walk. He had to lean on walls, benches, anything he could find, and even then he still managed to carry the man over his shoulders to the front desk. The security guards, stunned, rushed to help, but only after Ethan handed the man over to the doctors did he collapse. Right there, on the hospital floor. Not from the weight he carried, but from emotional burden, sheer exhaustion, and the sacrifice of someone who put others' lives before his own. And in that quiet fall, one of the most moving stories of this brutal summer was born. Ethan's death wasn't the end. It was a turning point. That moment changed everything. Because when someone gives their life for strangers, the world needs to stop and listen. News outlets tried to capture the magnitude of what had happened. They used powerful words, emotional headlines, but none of them truly did it justice. How can you explain in a few lines the depth of a gesture that transcends common sense? How do you define in headlines what can only be felt? Ethan died the way he lived, serving. And for those who understand the value of life, that kind of legacy outlives any era. The last image of Ethan alive is also the most symbolic. With chapped lips and blistered skin, he shared his last bottle of water with someone he didn't even know. That's not just a beautiful image, it's a practical lesson. One of those stories that cling to the soul and make us reflect. Because deep down, we all have a last bottle tucked away. A reserve of care, of time, of attention, of love. And the question remains, who are we willing to offer it to? After Ethan's death, the city came to a halt. Literally. Schools suspended classes for a day. Government offices held moments of silence. And on social media, the image of him carrying that man went viral as a symbol of collective redemption. Thousands began using the hashtag #Bethan. And the most beautiful part? The wave didn't stay online. It became action. Ordinary, anonymous people started handing out water on the streets, visiting isolated elderly, looking for sealed trailers. Because some stories are so powerful they don't need captions. They teach by example. Tributes followed. Children wrote essays titled The Waterman. Teachers turned his case into lessons on citizenship. Churches, community centers, and NGOs began organizing outreach in Ethan's name. Then came the most symbolic idea of all, founding an organization in his honor. The Ethan Project was born, aimed at supporting vulnerable people during extreme events like heat waves. And this NGO wasn't founded by businessmen or politicians. It was built by volunteers, by people touched by a story so real it could no longer be ignored. Little by little, Ethan became a symbol, not just as a hero, but as a new kind of courage, the courage to care. His mother, in an interview, shared that he always said a phrase that's now the organization's motto: I can't change the world, but I can change someone's day. That phrase began appearing on murals, in posters, in lectures. What once was a private intention became a public movement, and that's when the story gains power, when it stops being just memory and becomes continuation. Today, when thermometers spike, people remember Ethan, not with sadness, but with reverence. He became a case study in schools, a documentary in universities, an illustration in children's books. His name stands beside values like empathy, courage, and sacrifice. And more than that, Ethan became a verb. Let's Ethanize this street, say volunteers before handing out water down hot avenues. He's an Ethan in our community, they say when someone helps without expecting anything in return. Because stories, like his, don't end, they unfold into countless others. And even after all of this, new chapters of his story continue to emerge every day. People who now come forward to say, "He saved me." Others who weren't rescued but were inspired to act. Teenagers who gave up selfishness and chose solidarity. Business people who created aid centers on their own. A doctor who, after treating the man Ethan saved, decided to switch specialties and serve underprivileged areas. All of it because one man, alone, chose not to walk past. The hospital's security cameras captured something no movie script would dare to write. Ethan is seen entering, eyes squinting, face drenched in sweat, a limp man draped over his shoulder. He could barely stand himself, yet he didn't hesitate. He said nothing. He just walked, steady and silent, until he placed that body in the doctor's arms. Then, he collapsed, and it was there, on that cold hospital floor, between hurried feet and clinical protocols, that one of the most powerful stories of the summer began to echo across the nation. The video, initially shared in the emergency staff group, leaked from the hospital walls and went viral within hours. Social media, newspapers, local stations, even international outlets bowed to the power of that image. It wasn't just one man saving another. It was the embodiment of empathy in a time ruled by individualism. That scene crossed languages, borders, and ideologies. Because when a story is made of truth, it doesn't need subtitles. It speaks straight to the heart. Thousands of people commented, "Now that's a real hero." Where are the politicians while this is happening? Why did no one help before he did? But above all, the phrase that echoed the loudest was a simple and powerful one. There is still hope. And it's strange how all it takes is one true history to remind the world that humanity still beats strong, even when everything feels cold, automatic, and disposable. Many cried. Others fell silent, ashamed for never having done even half of what Ethan did. Some shared the video with heartfelt captions. Others showed it to their children as an example, and some even reevaluated their own behavior, because that recording wasn't made to go viral, it was made to transform, not just the perception of one event, but the way we look at others, at neighbors, strangers, the invisible. Suddenly, the whole country was talking about a simple man who did what so many refused to do. And when a history with that kind of weight explodes, it doesn't stand alone. It pulls others along. Soon, stories began to emerge. The elderly woman who received a bottle of water from him just hours before fainting. The 8-year-old boy who said Ethan was like a superhero who appeared out of nowhere. The nurse who had seen that same face days earlier, handing out wet towels in the square. Each account was a piece completing a human, tender, and deeply transformative puzzle. The truth is, Ethan wasn't an isolated case. He was the result of choices no one saw. Silent actions that didn't generate likes but saved lives. Because the greatest histories don't begin when a camera records, they begin when no one's watching. And even then, someone chooses to do the right thing. Ethan had been doing that for weeks. He'd go out with a backpack full of water, a mask, towels, and instructions. He was just one among many affected by the heat, but he chose not to be just another. And then came the questions. Who was this man? Why did he do it? How could he withstand so much heat, so much exhaustion, to help people he didn't even know? The answers began appearing in testimonies from neighbors, friends, and coworkers. Ethan was a delivery worker. He rode a bicycle, knew every alley, every corner of the city, and slowly, he noticed people weren't surviving the heat. He saw elderly people collapsing on sidewalks, kids with no water, people with nowhere to go, and he chose to act. He had no government position, no NGO, no sponsors, just one drive, not to sit back and watch. And that's what makes his history so powerful. It proves that doing good doesn't require a badge, a degree, or privilege. It requires presence, the courage to pause the rush and hear what the world is screaming. And Ethan listened, with his body, with his soul, with every drop of sweat he left behind. After the video went viral, the hospital released an official statement. They confirmed that the man Ethan had rescued survived, thanks to the speed with which he was brought in. They also revealed that Ethan was hospitalized for a few hours, dehydrated and exhausted, but lucid. And even there, lying on a gurney, he kept asking if the other man was okay. That's when we understand what separates a kind gesture from a transformative history. It's the sacrifice without guarantees, without applause, just the conviction that someone else's life is worth the effort. Days later, Ethan declined interviews. He said he didn't want fame, he just wanted people to help one another more. But the world had already decided that history wouldn't be forgotten. Schools started using the video in citizenship classes. Companies launched empathy campaigns. Influencers used their platforms to promote similar efforts. And in the streets, more backpacks like his began to appear, more bottles of water being handed out, more eyes paying attention to those who had fallen. And the most beautiful part? Ethan didn't create a movement. He inspired one. Because those who inspire don't command, don't demand, don't impose. They simply act. And the rest blooms. His actions sparked a wave of volunteering, spontaneous kindness, and human reconnection. Psychologists reported a rise in people seeking emotional support groups. Churches opened air-conditioned spaces for the homeless. Restaurants started giving out free water. All of this because of one true history, one simple history, one history that started with a single gesture. Ethan's name didn't fade with time. On the contrary, it became a symbol. A few days after his death, the Medal of Civil Courage was awarded to his mother in a quiet ceremony full of tears. Her voice trembling, she shared a phrase Ethan had said since he was a child. "I can't change the world, but I can change someone's day." That phrase became a seed for murals, posters, and reflection. And in every tribute, new histories of transformation began to bloom. Ethan's phrase was painted on the walls of schools, hospitals, and community centers. Not as marketing, but as a reminder. A reminder that good doesn't have to be grand, it just has to be done. Teachers used it as writing prompts. Psychologists quoted it in group therapy. It was as if somehow Ethan had become part of everyday life, not for what he said, but for how he lived. Because histories like his don't need megaphones, just heart. The recognition, though late, revealed a harsh truth. Sometimes, you have to die to be remembered. But with Ethan, something different happened. He wasn't just remembered and he was replicated. He inspired ordinary people to do what once felt too small to matter, even those who thought they couldn't make a difference. Because when a history cuts deep, it becomes a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. They just show us what we avoid seeing. And guess what? People are still changing because of him. In a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a group of young people created Simple Gesture Day, inspired by Ethan's history. On that day, no one needed to do anything spectacular. Just leave a note, offer a cup of water, or listen with care. Small actions that, when repeated, become culture. And culture, my friend, transforms generations. The most curious part? This movement grew without funding, without media, without influence. It grew because it was true, because it had meaning, because it was made of histories that don't need a stage. A retired teacher, who had always felt useless after leaving the classroom, shared that she started tutoring kids again in her garage. She said she was touched by a video of Ethan carrying water jugs to strangers under the scorching sun. She couldn't lift heavy things, but she could teach, and that's how she realized her usefulness hadn't expired. It had just changed form. And that, without a doubt, is yet another history he helped write without even knowing the characters. There was also the story of Lucas, a teenager bullied at school. After learning about Ethan's history, he wrote a letter to his classmates about empathy and courage. The gesture went viral among the students. Mockery turned into dialogue. Exclusion became an active listening campaign. And for the first time, Lucas felt like he belonged. "I'm not Ethan," he said in a packed auditorium, "but I can be someone better because of him." What he may not have realized is that in that moment, he too became a history, and the ripple effects didn't stop. Companies began rethinking their internal practices. Training programs added modules on empathy and social responsibility, using Ethan's history as a real-life example of leadership without a badge. A major supermarket chain began distributing bottled water on extremely hot days with labels reading, "For Ethan, for everyone." It wasn't advertising. It was awareness, a humble attempt to honor the sacrifice of someone who never asked for anything in return. And would you believe it? Even politicians, and those often so out of touch, had to bow to the power of histories. A city law was passed in Ethan's honor, requiring hydration stations in public spaces during the summer. A councilman, known for hollow speeches, admitted he changed his stance after watching a documentary about the young man. He said he cried, that he felt ashamed, and that he'd never look at a homeless person the same way again. Maybe it was just talk, maybe not. But look at how far histories reach. Even overseas, Ethan's name began to resonate. European universities included his case in ethics, citizenship, and climate action courses. A group of Norwegian students created a foundation in his name to help the elderly during heat emergencies. When asked about the inspiration, they replied, "It was a history that crossed the ocean." That's the thing. Some histories have no borders. They have roots. And the most striking part? Ethan's mother never sought fame or donations. She continued living in the same modest house, baking bread to sell in the neighborhood. But whenever someone approached her at the market and mentioned her son, she'd smile with teary eyes and say, "My son just wanted to be useful." Today, without knowing it, she has become the protagonist of other stories, of mothers who lost their children and found a way to smile again, of women who found a voice because they saw in her a symbol of silent strength, of people who realized that crying is human, but turning that cry into a bridge is divine. In every city where Ethan is remembered, a new action blossoms. It could be a lecture, a community drive, a poster, or just a solitary act. The size doesn't matter. The reach does. The intention does. And the most beautiful part is realizing that none of these actions require money, fame, or infrastructure. They only require presence, listening, heart. Because stories, born from goodness, never die. They simply multiply. And multiplication is the verb Ethan planted in the scorched earth of a country divided by individualism. So if one day you doubt the impact of a single life, remember him. A regular man, in a plain t-shirt, holding a bottle of water in one hand, and the weight of the world in his chest. A man who never wanted to be a hero, but became one. Because while many waited for perfect conditions, Ethan acted with what he had. And that's why today, every time someone helps a stranger, they are, even unknowingly, continuing his story. After Ethan's death, something changed in the city, and it wasn't just the weather. A silent transformation began, almost imperceptible at first, but profound. Grief didn't stop at tears or a few moments of silence on local radio. It became a movement. It started with small gestures, neighbors leaving bottles of water at apartment entrances, supermarkets offering free water fountains, schools introducing workshops on first aid and heatwave safety, all in his name, in the name of a life that was lost while doing good. For the first time, stories of solidarity weren't born from the heroism of superhumans, but from the memory of a common man who dared to do what was right. Emergency kits created by community groups began to circulate more frequently. Water bottles, moist towels, cereal bars, small maps showing cooling shelter locations, and on every package, a simple label, Ethan Project, because every life matters. This wasn't marketing. It was gratitude turned into usefulness, a way of saying, we heard this story, and can no longer pretend we don't know what matters. Even the most skeptical began to give in. Businesses adapted spaces to serve as shelters during peak hours. Churches opened their doors not just for prayers, but for fans and cold water. And most impressive of all, it was all spontaneous. No government order, no ad campaign, no politician's selfie. Ethan's gesture sparked a chain reaction that became hard to stop. People who had never participated in any social action were suddenly inviting neighbors to community meetings. It was as if that unbearable heat had also scorched the emotional coldness that dominated so many hearts. One elderly woman once said, "After hearing his story, I realized I'd been waiting too long to do too little." That phrase went viral. It ended up on flyers, t-shirts, school posters. Suddenly, the moral of the story didn't need to be explained. It was felt. From that fertile ground, the NGO was born. No money, no structure, no grand promises. Just the certainty that Ethan couldn't be remembered as just another number in a grim statistic. The name? Simple. Ethan Project. because it wasn't about creating something new, it was about continuing what he had already started, even unintentionally. In the beginning it was just 7 volunteers, ordinary people with jobs, bills, and tight schedules, but they chose to give a little of their time to plant something greater. And in the improvised first actions, the first stories began to be written, with tired feet but full hearts. The mission of the project was clear: to support people facing climate vulnerability. But more than that, it was about making every person feel seen, not as a victim but as someone worthy of care. Courses were created to teach residents how to respond to extreme conditions. Hydration workshops, recognition of heatstroke symptoms, and even support circles on mental health during climate disasters. Because heat doesn't just burn the skin, it consumes hope. And if there's one thing Ethan made clear with his actions, it's that no one should face it alone. Every new action by the NGO wrote another chapter in the stories. He began with his own steps. Over time, the Ethan Project began to draw attention, first in neighboring districts, then in nearby cities. Within months, the volunteer network had spread across 3 states, and in every branch the same structure: simplicity, listening, compassion. No big headquarters, just people committed to making sure another tragedy wouldn't happen due to inaction. This inspired other NGOs. Organizations fighting hunger, cold, domestic violence began to follow that same horizontal, community-based, empathic model. It was as if Ethan had proven that social impact doesn't require fame, only courage. And that's why so many stories emerged inspired by him. The most surprising part, however, happened beyond borders. In other countries, climate activists began citing Ethan as an example of humanitarian action during environmental crises. Universities included his name in case studies on ethics and civic responsibility. Some initiatives were even named Ethan Space, Ethan Care Line, or Ethan Network of Empathy. It was as if that rideshare driver, who never sought recognition, was being immortalized in a far more powerful way than any award or headline could offer. Because in the end, stories don't need a stage. They need purpose. And the ripple effect continues. On the streets, people tell of being saved thanks to Ethan Kitts, a child who didn't faint because her mother learned to recognize the signs, an elderly man who found shelter in time, a street vendor who now always carries extra water to give away. All of them quietly carry the imprint of that original gesture, and when they tell their experiences, they don't just talk about survival, they talk about transformation, about how one life can multiply into many. Because by acting, Ethan didn't just save bodies, he restored our humanity. And that's why his stories still echo. Some say he left too soon, and maybe he did. But there are also those who say he arrived exactly when the world most needed to be reminded of what compassion means. And on that point, there's no doubt. Ethan's memory isn't a tribute to the past, it's a call to the present, a reminder that indifference is a poison we only cure with action, and that no pain is in vain if it becomes a bridge to something greater. As so many stories show, pain can be a seed. And that's what Ethan left behind, a fertile field, ready to bloom. Survivors began filming homemade videos. No production, no scripts, just raw emotion. Ordinary people with trembling voices, sharing the exact moment Ethan showed up, like an angel in the middle of chaos. One woman said, "I had already said goodbye to life, until he knocked on my door." These stories spread across the country, not as laments, but as seeds of empathy. Because stories, told by those who lived them, are impossible to ignore. These testimonies became a national campaign about collective action. Billboards displayed real faces with short, striking phrases. He saw me. He heard me. Suddenly, schools started hosting empathy fairs. Companies invited psychologists to train staff in humanized service. Even young children began presenting school projects about the waterman. That's how stories become movements. Each testimony had its own weight, but they all shared one thing. Ethan didn't just save lives, he restored the hope of being seen. And in a world where so many feel invisible, that is revolutionary. Because sometimes, all someone needs is to be noticed, heard, welcomed. The words of those survivors didn't fade in videos, they echoed. And one of them, later on, became the spark for an unexpected twist. It was the testimony of a man who had once interviewed Ethan for a job, and humiliated him. He didn't recognize him at the time of the rescue. Only later, after seeing the viral videos, did the memory hit hard. He was the guy from the interview, the one I dismissed while laughing at his resume, he confessed in tears. That public acknowledgement of his mistake matched the arrogance he'd once shown, and that's where another of the great stories began. This man, named Samuel, was a top executive at a large corporation. He had status, money, influence, but he had never felt small until he was saved by someone he once belittled. The shame consumed him so deeply that he sought out the NGO created in Ethan's honor and offered to volunteer. He started from the basics, carrying boxes, cleaning barrels, listening to the stories of people he once would have ignored in a hallway. And the more involved he became, the more he shed his ego. Within months, he became a key fundraiser, a speaker on corporate empathy, a mentor for homeless youth, not out of charity, but as a form of redemption. Samuel became an example that stories aren't erased by apologies, but rewritten through actions. And ironically, he would say in his speeches, "I was saved twice, once from death, then from a dead conscience." The NGO grew. It became an institute, gained international recognition. And you know what's crazy? It never lost its essence. No big brand managed to buy its name. No marketing campaign dulled its simplicity, because the heart of the project was too human to be packaged. Young people from forgotten neighborhoods began leading chapters. Former homeless individuals became coordinators. It was as if Ethan was still there, working behind the scenes of every gesture. Meanwhile, the stories kept arriving. Handwritten letters, videos of children saying, "I want to be like Ethan." Mothers expressing gratitude for seeing their children become more sensitive. Even an inmate, after watching a documentary about Ethan in prison, decided to completely change his life. He requested a transfer to the reading wing, founded a writing club, and began teaching other inmates how to write their own stories. Because when one life touches another, the consequences are infinite. And the city, the one where it all began, it was transformed. The neighborhood where Ethan lived gained a new public square, with benches engraved with quotes inspired by his journey. Not empty phrases, but real statements from survivors. "He didn't judge me. He gave me water, but also gave me dignity. He made me feel human again. It was impossible to pass through without getting emotional." A place once forgotten by the authorities became a symbol of collective compassion. A few years later, a network of universities launched a mandatory course called Human Responsibility and Social Ethics, using Ethan's case as its foundation. Professors of law, psychology, social work, and even marketing used excerpts from the stories to provoke deep reflection. One professor in particular would say, "You may not remember what you had for lunch yesterday, but you'll never forget who gave you water when no one else remembered you existed." And that's where the real turning point happens. Because Ethan's legacy wasn't built on money or fame. It was built on consistency, on simple choices, on daily courage. He didn't save the world, but he saved enough so the world could begin saving itself. And maybe that's the most important lesson from these stories. The extraordinary doesn't live in grand acts. It lives in small ones done with greatness. On the 5-year anniversary of his passing, the country paused for a minute of silence. Schools stopped classes, companies turned off the lights, drivers pulled over. But the most moving tribute happened inside people's homes. Thousands raised their water glasses to the sky and said, "Thank you, Ethan. Not for heroism, but for reminding the world what it means to be human." Among the many lives Ethan touched with his quiet and courageous gesture, there was one that carried a nearly cruel irony. One of those twists only life, with its sharp narrative instinct, knows how to write. A young executive, successful and with a resume as impressive as his ego, discovered, bitterly, that he had been saved by the very man he once scorned. Years before, in a job interview, that same man had laughed at Ethan's modest resume, mocked his wrinkled shirt, dismissed the timid strength of his handshake, and turned him away coldly, without even a "thank you for coming." At the time, Ethan left the room holding back tears and preserving his dignity. He walked slowly to the bus stop, feeling like the corporate world had no place for someone like him. Simple, honest, and filled with more determination than degrees. But he didn't complain. He kept trying, kept helping, kept living with kindness, even where there was no room for it. And time, which sees all, kept that moment, not as an ending, but as the seed of one of the most surprising stories the future would write. When the deadly heatwave hit the city, and Ethan gave his life to save strangers, the executive was one of the people helped. He was weak, dehydrated, on the verge of collapse in the middle of the street, when someone handed him a bottle of cold water and helped him to safety. He only found out days later through the news who had made that life-saving gesture. When he saw Ethan's photo on the front page, the ground vanished beneath him. He remembered the face, the voice, the interview, the arrogance. And there, in the silence of his living room, something broke inside him. It was shame, yes, but also awakening. It was as if all the stories he had ignored in his life came back to demand his presence. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of who he had become. And more than that, the urgency to change. Driven by this emotional storm, he sought out the NGO created in Ethan's honor. He arrived quietly, head down, and offered to help. At first he was just another volunteer among many, carrying water crates, cleaning reused jugs, sorting donations. But as he listened to the real stories of those receiving help, single mothers, lonely elders, thirsty children, something deeper began to shift. The man who once calculated everything in terms of profit and performance began to listen. And listening, truly listening, changes everything. Over time, donating or organizing was no longer enough. He wanted to do more. That's when a new mission was born, bringing Ethan's story into the corporate world. He began giving talks about corporate empathy, social responsibility, and most importantly, the danger of judging someone by their shoes or the school they didn't attend. His words hit hard, perhaps because before touching others, they had first transformed himself. Arrogance gave way to humility. Indifference yielded to service. His individual transformation, so unexpected yet powerful, became a model within the company he worked for. Inspired by his journey, management revised their inclusion policies, expanded social support programs, and created affirmative positions for people in vulnerable situations. Employees began suggesting initiatives, joining volunteer actions, thinking beyond profit. Ethan, even in absence, was educating. That is the power of real stories. They teach, even after the protagonist is gone. What's most impressive is how Ethan's legacy didn't stop there. Because when a story is strong enough, it spreads like hot wind on a dry afternoon, only in this case bringing relief instead of suffering. Universities began citing the case in ethics classes. Schools adopted his name in citizenship projects. Children started mimicking his gestures on the streets, handing water to street cleaners, comforting classmates at recess. Ethan became a verb, a reference, an answer to questions adults love to complicate. And you know what else? The NGO, which started with a simple banner and a few recycled containers, became a national model. It gained international recognition. It won awards. But none of that was as moving as the testimonials that still arrive daily. People who never met Ethan, but felt the impact of his story. People who changed careers, reconciled with family, went from apathy to action, just because they heard what he did and what he inspired. Meanwhile, the once arrogant young executive, now a true agent of impact, continued his mission, but not as a hero. He insisted on remembering that he had failed, that he had been arrogant, that he once mocked a man worth infinitely more than any MBA. And it was precisely that public recognition of his own failure that made his journey so powerful. Because sometimes the stories that teach us most aren't about those who got it right, but those who got it wrong and learned from it. Today, his name is cited in leadership courses, and his most famous quote is repeated at seminars across the country. What you do when no one is watching defines who you are, but what you do after looking in the mirror defines who you can become. That phrase became the NGO's motto. It's painted on murals, printed on t-shirts, not because it's pretty, but because it captures the essence of all the stories that sprouted from that unbearable heat. Ethan's, the executives, each volunteers, every life touched. And believe this, there's still more to come, because the legacy of a true story never ends. It branches out, it invites, it wakes those sleeping in the comfort of their egos. And if you've read this far, maybe you feel the call too. Maybe there's a part of you still waiting to be awakened, challenged, pushed to leave the not my problem mindset. Maybe, like that executive, you need a nudge, not to save the whole world, but to start by saving an attitude. Ethan had no superpowers, no wealth, no fame, no spotlight. He had thirst, he had courage, he had compassion. And because of that, he became a symbol that the most powerful stories don't need a stage, just truth. And when truth finds someone willing to act, the impact is inevitable. Today, every time another heatwave approaches, the name Ethan Myers rises like a whisper of hope in the chaos. It's no exaggeration to say he has become a kind of silent symbol, one that needs no statues or official honors to remain alive. In classrooms across the country, teachers don't describe Ethan as a tragedy, but as a seed. They speak of courage, empathy, and raw, beautiful humanity. And that's how stories are born and kept alive, not by sensationalism, but by example. In schools, young children learn that a hero doesn't always wear a cape, have powers, or make the headlines. Sometimes he just carries a bottle of water, an old cap, and a heart that refuses to give up. Ethan did what many avoid. He paused, he noticed, he cared, and he acted. That's why every year thousands of schools in different states celebrate Ethan Day, a symbolic date when students are encouraged to perform anonymous acts of kindness. They distribute water on the streets, help neighbors, write letters of affection to strangers. Not out of duty, but because they understand that great stories begin with small actions. Ethan became more than a name. He became a metaphor, a bridge between generations. Documentaries were made to immortalize his journey, some investigative, others poetic, but all with the same purpose, to show that it's not just about how he died, but how he lived, and most importantly, why he chose to live that way. Children's books illustrate his journey with vibrant colors and strokes that capture the innocence of someone who just wanted to help. Kids read these stories and ask, "Mom, can I be like Ethan too?" And the answer is always, yes, you already are. At science fairs, high school students began developing projects aimed at tackling climate emergencies, all inspired by Ethan's mission. Thermal backpacks with handmade cooling systems, drones to monitor at-risk elderly people, apps mapping sources of clean water. Each initiative bears the same quote at the bottom: "If you're thirsty, someone else is too." That phrase, attributed to Ethan, was never written by him, but it was born from who he was. And when a story becomes a quote, it no longer belongs to just one person, it belongs to everyone. Some universities went even further. Departments of social sciences and ethics began using his story as a case study. Deep discussions emerged from his actions. What keeps us from responding to another's pain? What is the cost of indifference? What kind of legacy are we building by ignoring others? Students wrote theses, hosted discussion circles, organized social actions. Ethan, who never sought fame, became an academic inspiration, not for spectacle, but for the courageous simplicity with which he did what was right. And that's what makes some stories immortal, their power to silently shift collective consciousness. Most moving of all is how his name keeps showing up in the unlikeliest places. A graffiti mural deep in a favela that reads, "More Ethan, less ego." A hand-drawn poster in an immigrant neighborhood with the phrase, "Gracias, Ethan." A worn-out sticker on the back of a water truck, "Be like Ethan." He became part of popular culture, not through media hype, but through organic merit. His story transcended social classes, language barriers, and walls of prejudice. Because when truth meets compassion, no system stays the same. People who've never met each other share heartfelt posts on social media. The elderly woman who survived thanks to water left by a volunteer inspired by Ethan. The delivery man who carries an extra water bottle for whoever's worse off. The nurse who left a shift to rescue homeless people at night, saying he thought of Ethan. These are details, gestures, seeds, and each one is the continuation of a story that seems to have no end. Ethan became a symbol of an era that urgently needs more soul. In a world that's increasingly fast-paced, individualistic, and numbed by its own rush, he reminded us that sometimes stopping can be the fastest form of empathy, that observing can be more powerful than speaking, that offering a sip of water can be as transformative as building a dam. His actions were simple, but his message is profound. Don't wait for perfect conditions to do good. Be the condition. And this lesson, retold in thousands of ways, became one of the greatest stories of our time. What's most impressive is how his memory stays vivid, even among those who never met him. Youth groups organize water drives wearing shirts that say Team Ethan. Subway stations now have water fountains with plaques in his honor. In some neighborhoods, communities came together to build shaded tents in critical areas of the city, with the motto, "Here, Ethan still lives." Because some stories don't die, they become collective actions, culture, living memory, And it all started with a gesture, a choice, a moment when someone decided to feel another's pain as if it were their own. Ethan wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, he wasn't an influencer, but he had what many lose along the way: presence. He showed up where it was hard to be, did what was easy to ignore, and that's why he became eternal. Eternal in the memory of those who saw him, in the conscience of those who heard, in the actions of those who learned. Because that's how great stories are written, not with ink, but with truth. And now that you've made it this far, take a deep breath and answer honestly. How many people have you ignored while rushing to handle life? How many times have you closed your eyes to someone collapsed on the street, or sped up when someone was asking for help? It's hard to admit, I know. But maybe that's exactly why Ethan's story touched you so deeply. Because it wasn't made to comfort. It was made to unsettle, to hold up a mirror to your hurry, and a magnifying glass to the details you've learned to overlook. Ethan wasn't rich, wasn't famous. He didn't have followers or a degree on the wall. What he had was thirst, literally, and a bottle of water in his hand. He could have drunk it alone, locked himself inside, pretended it wasn't his problem. But he did the opposite. He turned his own need into a starting point to care for others. While many hid in air-conditioned rooms, he crossed streets with bottles, improvised shade with old sheets, and handed out care in the form of empathy. All this, during the deadliest heat wave in U.S. history. Some people are born to accumulate. Ethan was born to give. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about time, attention, presence. Because in a time when everything is measured in likes and clicks, he chose to measure his worth in smiles, in whispered thank yous from people who no longer believed in kindness. He didn't want applause. He wanted to change something, and he did. With little, he did a lot. With nothing, he did everything. And that's why this story needs to be told, needs to be felt. But let's talk about you now. What are you doing with what you have? Are you waiting to have more time, more money? Recognition, maybe? Let me tell you something Ethan taught with his own life. Good isn't done when there's time. Good is done when someone decides to be time in the life of someone who has none left. And that doesn't require wealth. It requires courage, presence, and a kind of listening that goes beyond the ears. It comes from the heart. That's why this story hurts. Because it pulls us out of our comfort zone. It shoves in our face how much we've normalized selfishness, how we've become experts at justifying omission. I can't get involved. I don't know how to help. It's not my business. But what if it is? What if it's exactly your business? What if out of all who passed by, it was you who was meant to stop? Ethan stopped. And because of that, he saved lives. Literally. Because yes, people would have died on those sidewalks if he hadn't chosen to act. Remember the elderly woman he found collapsed in the shadow of a wall? Many people passed by. Some even said they'd call for help, then kept walking. But Ethan knelt down, stayed with her, made her a pillow with his own backpack, offered water, and stayed until the ambulance arrived. That day he didn't just save a life, he reignited hope. Because when she woke up and saw a stranger holding her hand, she cried. Cried from gratitude, from surprise, from humanity. That's what we're talking about here. Humanity. A kind of love you don't learn in college, and you can't buy in a store. A love that reveals itself when no one is watching. That happens in the silence, in the heat, in the chaos. And when it does, it changes everything around it. Ethan died doing just that, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he could no longer ignore. And that's the difference between living and merely existing. Those who live leave traces. Those who exist just pass by. Maybe you're thinking, but I'm just one person. And you're right. You are just one. But so is Ethan. And look at what he did. Look how many stories he inspired. People who used to sit with arms crossed now cross neighborhoods with lunchboxes. Teens glued to screens now walk the streets collecting blankets. Families who barely spoke have united to build community aid stations. All of this because a nobody chose to be somebody at the right moment. So tell me, what are you going to do with all of this now? Will you turn off the video and pretend nothing happened? Close the browser and go back to handling life? Or will you actually start writing your part of this story? Because yes, it's yours too. The world doesn't change through emotional speeches. It changes with silent actions, with small gestures, with choices no one sees but that make all the difference. It changes with courage, and with people who still believe it's worth trying. Maybe you're waiting for a sign, a push, a green light. Consider this text your call. You don't need to wait anymore. Change won't knock on your door with a red carpet. It'll find you in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the rush, in the middle of your excuses. And you'll have to decide, will you keep watching stories as a spectator, or will you get up and start living them? The truth is, Ethan wasn't special. He was just whole. In a world full of halves, he chose to be complete in what he did. And that's why this story lives on, because it doesn't end with his death. It begins when someone like you decides to continue what he started, maybe with a cup of water, a look, a listening ear, a hug, an action. The world doesn't need more likes. It needs more Ethans. If you've made it this far, answer me truthfully. What action will you take after this story? It doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be honest. It has to come from within. Comment below what touched you most. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that it's still worth believing in humanity. And subscribe to the channel, because as long as there's someone to tell these stories, there will be someone ready to live them. And that changes everything.